Great. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thanks, Andy, for introducing me. And thank you so much, the ICT Forest community. I'm really excited to be here, also very nervous, because I realize I'm talking about technology with a room full of computer scientists and technology specialists. But really, thanks a lot, Zhao and Elena, for making my visit here so enjoyable, and all the lovely people I've met so far. So I'm going to take, as Andy said, about 45 minutes, hopefully, and then, of course, we can have some discussion. And this is really a way to throw out some ideas that we've had while conducting one of our research projects funded by Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. The project was called Gendering the Smart City, and the website is here. It's www.gendersmartcity.com in case you want to learn more about the projects and the different outputs that we've had so far. So let me just start with the talk here today. It's titled Our Stories, Our Voices, a Feminist Toolkit for Digital Justice in the Urban Margins. So on, I'll do it here, don't worry. Yep. So on 1st January 2019, we launched a month-long public exhibition in the main concourse of Mandi House. Mandi House is one of the largest metro stations in Delhi, in India. And Mandi House sees literally, on an average, every day about 11,000 commuters. And so this was in the main concourse of Mandi House, where we launched the exhibition. And it was a month long, and it really was, the exhibition was called Coming and Going. So in the common language, in Hindi, it's Ana Jana, and was really about the women's who live in the peripheries, their comings and goings between the home, the phone, and the city. The exhibition presented a genre of authoring that was almost exclusively from WhatsApp diary entries that were made by these young women who were living in a slum resettlement colony in Delhi's urban periphery. The authorship was meant to evoke a sort of creative practice that was simultaneously collaborative between us as a research team and these young women who were struggling in various ways that I can talk about in a moment. And this collaborative was very intimate, very embodied. We were all tied to that WhatsApp diary, closed WhatsApp group. But the exhibition that came out of it, once installed, also turned the gaze of these women upon themselves. And they began to reflect upon the intersection of the structural, the infrastructural, and the gender-based violence that had kept them excluded from the city at large, but also in the long term from the city's kind of history of urban development and planning. And one of the women said when she came to see the exhibition, I'm really loving this day very much. I feel so happy. I cannot imagine what I have achieved. I never thought I'd be able to do this, but I accepted this challenge and completed it. I learned so much as well. This is only an example, a trailer. The whole film is yet to be done. We have just touched the tip. More power to you, sister. And it'll be clearer later on why she says more power to you, sister, in the end. So this for us was a big achievement, not just for the women, because we had struggled at many times in keeping kind of the true ethos of collaboration and co-production with them. We felt that the exhibition showcased, sorry, let me just go back to the slide. The exhibition showcased an important pathway through which digital technologies, despite its many contradictions, its weaknesses, and many critiques that it's had so far, it could and still should empower women or marginal communities to author their own stories across digital and analog spaces. And we're using the word authorship rather than ownership, particularly as a critique of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we're particularly looking at the two Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 5, which is empowering women, and Goal 11, which is sustainable cities and communities. And if you look at the targets and indicators, and particularly these two goals, but it's spread across all the SDG goals, digital empowerment, digital technologies is seen as a key tool, both a target and an indicator of empowerment. And particularly Goal 5, this explicit targets saying women should own mobile phones. So we were actually critiquing this, suggesting that it's not just ownership or possession of a mobile phone, rather the ability and developing a capacity to author your own stories, your own struggles within digital space, to be present and visible in digital space in your own voices. And so we found that the key pathway to potentially empowering is not just through these UN Sustainable Development Goal indicators, or even philanthropic organizations like the Global Gates Foundation, which sort of really promote ownership of phones. But it is the enablement of authorship of women's own stories in their own voices that can possibly bring about change. But I'm sort of running ahead of myself because I'm talking about what emerged in the end, the exhibition. So this talk will be more of backtracking in terms of how did we create this exhibition? How did we get here? What were the pathways and practices that made this exhibition possible? And then, of course, where do we go from here? So my talk today explores the pathways towards digital collaboration and co-production with young women who lived in this resettlement colony in Delhi's urban periphery. So this is the map of Delhi. Resettlement colonies, just to kind of give a context for people not familiar, resettlement colonies are not slums. Resettlement colonies are colonies that are authorized by the state and based on certain eligibility criteria, given to citizens or people who have been evicted from slums in the city center. So this is my geography here for the day, hopefully. So this is the plan map of Delhi. And if you see the purple circles, these were the eviction sites. So you have the whole kind of story of rural migrants coming into the city, settling in public land inside the city, and over a period of time settling there, building their houses. And at one point, the state decides that they need that land for some capital investment projects or infrastructure projects for whatever, or generally they don't like the presence of slums in the city, and they evict them, often violently demolish their houses. And in some cases, it's a planned eviction where they're given resettlement sites outside on the peripheries. And here you see the red squares. And you'll see, of course, they're pulled out from the city center and thrown out into the urban peripheries, the urban margins. And the areas, the two resettlement sites that we were working in were these two on the southeast of the city. And these were sites that had been resettled from evictions happening in these three purple dots in the city center. So resettlement colonies, although they are legal, they're authorized by the state, they have a particular urban imaginary. They're seen as peripheral to the city, both culturally, socially, but also, of course, geographically. And they are invisible in the social and geographical imaginaries of a city in the context where Delhi particularly is an increasing technocratic city. It's been mapped to death. It's been mapped and mapped and mapped with CCTVs, with drones, with GIS, with remote sensing. Every inch of space in Delhi has been mapped. So in a way, they're still included in the maps of Delhi. And through these satellite mapping, it's pretty clear what's going on to the state, but yet they don't really feel included. They're not really included in the different programs and in the kind of digital revolution of the city. So networks are really poor. You don't really have that many mobile phone towers there. Networks connections drops really quickly, and also infrastructure that is commuting in and out of the city, transport infrastructure is really poor. So in many ways, both digitally and materially, people living in these peripheries are disconnected from the city. So when we think about resettlement colonies, then it's important to, particularly in this day, with the digital revolution that's taken shape in India, particularly in the global south, it's important to think about them not just materially, but also digitally. What happens when we overlay this exclusion to the periphery, both geographically, but exclusion to the periphery, both digitally. And here I want to borrow Nishant Shah's work, where he talks about these places as the networked margins. It's a blending together of the edge and the margin. And this is what's looked like. We went up one of the houses and took a picture of the road. So in all sorts of imaginaries of the city, this looks like a slum, but it's actually it's not illegal. It's not something that's happened on its own. It's something that the state has designed. So it's both, it's a networked margin because it's networked. The young people in these areas, they all have mobile phones. They're very highly hyper connected. And at the same time, it's still in the margin because that connection does not enable them to access the benefits that digital revolution offers them. So the recent urban transformations that's happened across India that has been kind of riding the success of the digital revolution, particularly has focused on women. And in Delhi particularly, because I don't know again how much you know about India, Delhi has been notorious in the news globally for its gender-based violence. And so Delhi particularly has ridden the technology revolution to try and create smart, safe cities. And you see here examples of this where it's hyper-connected in a way that offers surveillance as a solution to crime and deviance, and particularly also to gender-based violence. This recent move towards creating smart, safe cities through new smart technologies are contingent upon surveillance, and surveillance through CCTV, of course, but also GPS-enabled response vehicles, and particularly for women, safety apps that are pushed through the smartphones. But these are all often conceived with, as I said, surveillance as a solution to gender-based violence. But they also, the beneficiaries imagined in these kind of surveillance solutions are cisgendered male middle-class residents as the main beneficiaries. And this sort of surveillance particularly is also focused, concentrated on the city centers, not really on the periphery. So in any case, women do not, even if they are meant to, the women coming from the peripheries do not really benefit these sorts of surveillance technologies. But also on the one hand, the other hand, what they also do is, coming from really conservative, traditional families living in these peripheries, these surveillance technologies in the city, they really extend the surveillance that their families are imposing on their bodies and spaces to the city at large. So not only are they surveilled and controlled by their families and in the neighborhood, but when they reach the city, they are then surveilled and controlled by these CCTV cameras, by the police vans, and if they have safety apps, then the family can also track where they're moving in the city. So young women in the peripheries find themselves unable to benefit from these top-down technological solutions, not least because these technologies do not reach the peripheries, because the peripheries, as I said, are characterized by very fragmented and disconnected infrastructures, but also because these are constructing surveillance as a solution to violence. And so on the one hand, digital technologies are not a sign of empowerment, but on the other hand, all of these women have mobile phones. In a way, they're also sitting in a very contradictory generational gap. As children of rural migrants, they are aspirational. They see themselves as urban citizens. They don't want to do the kind of jobs that their parents have done. They don't want to become manual laborers. They don't want to become domestic workers. They want to ride India's economic growth success. So they want kind of what is called quote unquote respectable jobs. But at the same time, because of this particular context, they're also in very precarious jobs. So there's a high turnover, they get hired and fired, they are in kind of service sector work, temporary work, part-time work, hourly paid. If they don't reach work on time, they're fired immediately. So they have this kind of contradictory position where they're riding the success with these mobile phones. They know a lot more, they're very well informed because of YouTube and all the kind of websites they go in, but at the same time, their aspirations are not really being fulfilled. So that's sort of the context. And just before I go on, I just wanted to mention our partners and all the people who worked on this project. We worked with very good local partners, a social enterprise, a digital social enterprise, as well as a local NGO who was working in these resettlement colonies for a very, very long time. And of course, our research assistants, who I should obviously give a mention to. And we also had a creative team working with us. So as I started off, the whole purpose was to think about these digital technologies as a way of co-creating and co-producing particular ways to speak to the city, speak back to the city, speak back to the state officials, speak back to policymakers. And we realized that no end of reports, they just sit on the shelves and they don't really do the job that they're doing. And we thought it was important to make it arts-based, creative in a way that would speak to the city at large rather than just to politicians and policymakers. So the second part of this talk, I want to go into talking about this feminist toolkit that we created from this WhatsApp group and all the stuff that came out of the WhatsApp group. But let's start with a toolkit. What is a toolkit and how we saw a toolkit as contributing to this sort of pathway? For us, a toolkit is a collection of authoritative and adaptable resources that enables the intended user to learn about an issue and identify approaches for addressing them. Toolkits can help translate theory into practice and typically target one issue or one audience. And that's the second line is really where we were stressing, how do we create, how do we work with the toolkit? How do you create a toolkit that can be adaptable in different contexts? So the toolkit I present today is a loose collection of mechanisms, of instruments and guidelines to push back against the sort of networks of power and authority that is present in digital space. And any of us who are in social media know how much it is taken over by kind of particular social groups, how particularly in India, where how women face a lot of violence and trolling on social media as well. So it was also about creating a space in digital platforms, which is safe as well. So that WhatsApp group worked in that way. And in doing so, I'm just going to use two quotes here. In the first case, we thought that this toolkit could be a form of decolonization. So decolonization, I'm not talking about empire building, but the colonization of digital space that's happened by private corporations, by middle-class workers, by men particularly, in which that kind of sidelines and excludes particularly young women who are coming from low and middle income backgrounds, they're kind of sidelines. So we draw upon Emma Perez's idea of the decolonial imaginary. How do we create a decolonial imaginary that crosses between digital and material spaces? And this would be an alternative to dominant ideas of history and knowledge present in the urban and digital realms. So much of this idea of history for these women and for these kind of low-income communities comes from what they see, what they read on digital spaces. They don't go to the archives, they don't go to particular books to read them. They find their history from digital platforms. So how do we kind of decolonize these digital platforms to give a sense of history, to be present historically? And then the other work we draw upon is Lily Irani, Kavita Philip, and Paul Durish's work, where they talk about toolkit providing tactics, ways of proceeding, and need-to-know approaches to reality that expand the transdisciplinary scope of what one needs to know. What do they need to know in order to be present in digital spaces, to have a safe digital experience? So that's our toolkit, kind of graphically. So I'm going to talk about four pathways. The first one being curating local histories. And so with the pathways, do you see my, no, you don't see this. Is this the point? Yeah. So curating local histories, what we did was a Wikipedia edit-a-thon, and I'll talk about that. Creating safe spaces online, primarily was our WhatsApp group. That was actually also the kind of initiator of all of these conversations and finally the exhibition through these WhatsApp diaries. The third pathway was producing and performing the spoken word. So again, creative endeavors where we produced a rap song, and hopefully I'll have time to play that. And then finally, enriching voices with stories and stories with voices through community podcasts, which we did right at the end during COVID, when we couldn't actually meet face to face. And I present this feminist toolkit as a digital, a visual, and a participatory pathway to an intimate form of collaboration of authoring, collaboration and authoring that emerges by visually composing with and learning with each other, learning with rather than learning from, but also then using this to speak back to the realities and constraints of space, of technology and power. Through the toolkit, I'm mapping the pathways for those dispossessed of the public sphere of the city, as well as the public digital realm of all these digital platforms, to see and speak through their phone and thus enrich urban digital spaces through the affective and subjective data on their lives. And again, this is very important to think about data as affective and subjective, because a lot of the data that's collected about slum dwellers, about resettlement colonies, about young people are very quantitative. They're in numbers. And so there is very little scope for them to be present in digital space through their voices. That doesn't quantify their experiences to numbers of how many miles have they got to travel to reach the city, how many buses do they need to change. So that sort of data is very different from being able to actually speak about their struggles in digital space. So the first one is co-producing or curating local histories. Here, I want to talk about one of the first things that we did as a workshop was a Wikipedia editathon that was led by my colleague Padmini Ray Murray, which we conducted with these young women. This editathon was to write about the history of their resettlement colony and be present in Wikipedia, because anytime you try to find out anything about resettlement colonies, there really is nothing there online, unless you type their name on Google, type the name of the resettlement colony on Google, and all you get on Google is media reports of crime and violence. So we wanted to document their history of moving from the city center to these peripheries and actually write that down in Wikipedia. So this editathon was to write about the history of their roots from migrants as migration as slum dwellers, eviction, and finally resettlement in the peripheries, and was intended to give them visibility in a platform that, like Wikipedia, that is known to be inclusive and democratic than other usual suspects that you have is Google. But yet, as soon as we started the editathon, we came upon a number of roadblocks, and this sort of speaks to the marginality that they face. One was that each of them had this really kind of basic phone, and it was very, very difficult for them to get network, to actually edit anything online together. So they couldn't register. Even if they registered, the connection got broken. It was also very difficult for them to write in English. So what we tried to do then to get around it was to put it on Post-it notes. So we actually did this very analog system of writing their histories on Post-it notes and sticking them there. And then we collected them, and we then had to put all of that information in Wikipedia in a structured way that Wikipedia needs. So we then put this up in Wikipedia here. So it's still there. It's Madanpur Khadar JJ colony. You can go on Wikipedia and find their history, and it talks about about their colony in a way that Wikipedia requires of it, but also it talks about the history of the struggles that they faced, which was not there anyway. But then we faced our final roadblock as we uploaded the page. Wikipedia marked it with a serious notice regarding its citation trail. And it was really interesting because it said that this document will be taken down, this page will be taken down because it doesn't have a citation trail. It cannot be authenticated. And this concerned us as a team, since Wikipedia threatened to remove the article because it did not cite reliable published sources. And in the context of editathon, where most of the page was written based on firsthand experiences of these young women, we could only conclude that their knowledge was not according to Wikipedia's editorial policy, deemed as, quote, legitimate. So what we did is we finally got around this by talking about slums as well in this article, and through that we cited ourselves and others who were published authors who were writing about slums and Delhi's kind of slum eviction policy and so on. And so we had enough citations, authenticated public citations in there to keep the Wikipedia page going. So it's still there. But our facilitation of the authoring of the Wikipedia article can easily be dismissed as it's not truly representative, it's not truly collaborative or participatory, because look, they just did it on Post-it notes and we put it online. And you can also even question us whether we really achieved anything to improve digital capacity at all. But it can also be seen as a way that you could talk about direct praxis, a way in which these women learned. And it was really enlightening for us because these women says, we never knew that we could write anything on digital space. We thought that was done by other people. How can we even talk about our stories and put them on Wikipedia? So this was a tactic for us to open up for the women a space that is a possibility, a tactic that enables them to write alongside privileged mediators in digital space, working within the existing frameworks and facing all these struggles and overcoming them, but also tacitly to subvert the site's kind of ideological framework about authenticated published knowledge. So this was oral history that they were writing, but it was possible for them to still stay there and exist as a Wikipedia page. The second pathway that I've already talked about was to create safe online spaces. And this was really important for us because often they don't have safe material spaces. Sometimes the home itself is the most unsafe for these women. And so it was important that we had a WhatsApp closed space in which they were talking to their peers and to us in a completely supportive and empathetic environment. And they were not just talking about violence at all. They were writing their diaries. I went here today, I went there today. So you can see sort of screenshots of our WhatsApp diary. And there was a lot of emojis and a lot of voice notes and a lot of images, text, videos, etc. So this WhatsApp group enabled real-time, free-flowing conversations between us and the women. And although we were aware of this contested nature of WhatsApp diary and WhatsApp diaries, WhatsApp can be actually a really unsafe place if it's too many people who don't know each other. So we were very clear that we had to keep it a closed group. And also, of course, now in India, WhatsApp has become complicit, often with state surveillance. It was not so much at that time. But we realized that it was important to have this WhatsApp space to provide a safe space where often material safe spaces for these women were very, very hard to find. The WhatsApp diaries created, again, a different genre of authorship, where they were writing all of this stuff. It has wide appeal, particularly amongst the youth in a digital age, because they were also, with their writing, they were also putting up a lot of selfies, putting up a lot of poetry and free verse. And that's where the idea of the rap song came about later on. There was a lot of shorthands, there was a lot of emojis. And in this space, we felt that the women were using both parody, but they were using also dark humor to also transform their own shame, humiliation, and the fear that they felt in public spaces into sort of their reflection. Why does it happen? What have we got to do about it? So they were transforming that into reflection, but also refusal and resistance against these kinds of gender-based violence that they were facing. So I don't have the time to talk about all of the stuff that emerged because it was a really, really rich space. But one of the things that came about was selfies. It was inundated by selfies. And we all know with the youth nowadays, we all did it. We were doing selfies yesterday. Selfies is a key mode of expression. And we really, the image that you see on the left was one of our exhibition panels. It was about WhatsApp diaries and selfies. And we worked with a cartoon artist as well who changed their faces because there was an issue about anonymity. So you see the faces changed. But the selfies produced, we felt, was a space of solidarity. Selfies were very significant in this context where violence, networked violence, was a pervasive experience and vulnerability. So not just that they were getting a lot of violence through WhatsApp, through unknown people trying to kind of address them and sending nude images, etc., through Facebook, but also that when they were in the buses or in walking on the streets, they were facing a lot of violence. So selfies was actually a form of resistance to say, hey, I was here in the city. And they would often take these selfies when they went out together with friends. So it was also kind of a coming of age, a form of friendship, a form of marking themselves in the city spaces, in the urban spaces. Selfies marked their freedoms as snapshot moments during the continuous anticipation of violence. They were continuously thinking about violence. And this violence, as I said, pervaded between the home, the phone, and the city. Selfies also enabled witnessing of potential danger. And there was one selfie in which one of these women, she got into a bus to get home, and she was terrified because the bus was filled with men who were just staring at her. And she actually took a selfie and put it on our WhatsApp group, saying, I'm really terrified. And look, all these men behind me, can you see them staring? And they were literally looking at her like that. And we were all very worried about her. We were saying, just keep in touch. Let us know when you reach home safely. So it was also a space where they were marking and witnessing potential danger and witnessing the intense vulnerabilities of fear of violence. And in this context, safety was not seen just through these geolocational capabilities of these smart apps. So when they use smart apps, you can pin, you can tag, this is where I faced violence, this is where I felt threatened. But it wasn't a geolocational capability. It was rather in using the mobile phone they were witnessing danger, witnessing potential danger, and even writing texts on violence and the confinement that they experienced across all the different spaces in the city. So I'm going to quote Nunez here, who writes about selfies in a really interesting way. Selfies, they say, is this act of self-witnessing serves as a form of parasocial civic engagement that attempts to communicate one's own place within interpenetrating social spaces, no matter how gawking or disengaged they may appear at first analysis. So I think we need to take selfies very seriously, particularly amongst youth who feel marginalized, gendered subjects who feel marginalized in the city and in the home. Then we come to the spoken word. And this again came about from our WhatsApp group, because we had so many of these women actually making parodies, writing poetry, writing little verses about their experiences. So we decided when we meet face to face, we're going to actually do a workshop in which we write poetry. And we gave them different words. So they had a word like light, write about light. And they started writing about, infrastructure, electricity. We gave them a word like air. They started writing about pollution and in verse form. And so this collaboration, this kind of face-to-face workshops, it helped us understand that there's a lot of creative potential amongst these women. And actually, just with a little bit of support, it will be possible for them to write texts about their struggles. So we had this idea that we would write a song. And because these texts were literally kind of two-line verse formats, we collected all of that, we edited that with them, and we landed up with a rap song that was written and performed by the women with our support, of course. And this charted the kind of gendered experiences of moving in and out of the home, the phone, and the city. I'm going to play the song now, and then I'm going to talk about what happened with the songs. I hope it plays. Yes. Okay, so that was the song, and I said I will tell you a little bit more about it. What we decided that we would have just a rap song for us to listen to, for the women to listen to and share. Once we created the sound and the song, and we brought them together, we played in front of them, we had lots of tears and emotions, obviously, but the next question was, where is the video? And we said, well, we hadn't actually decided to do a video. And then the women said, well, if we don't have the video on YouTube, how are we going to get famous? And this was really interesting for us as research team, because we function with the university frameworks of ethics and confidentiality and anonymity. And here was this women wanting to show their faces, wanting to speak in their own voices, wanting to be present in YouTube, completely breaking down all the ethical rules about confidentiality, etc. So we had to go back to the university, ask for an amendment in our ethical approval. And then we landed up getting one of a film kind of directors who works with sort of participatory methods to then do this film. Once we did the film, we put it up on YouTube, and it just went viral. And to the extent that all the media outlets began reporting on it nationally. It got picked up by National Geographic, and then they wrote a piece on it. The women then began to be invited into forums in the news channels to talk about gender-based violence. And also then the women got invited into specific panels in the Delhi state, where the Delhi at that time were discussing a new gender sensitive master plan for the next kind of 20 years. And they got invited to some of these panels with NGOs to talk about gender-based violence. So all I'm trying to say is this wasn't really a kind of technological innovation, but at the same time, it was using kind of really frugal technologies to be present in YouTube space. And that was all that they needed for it to go really viral. And I think it's probably got about over 50,000 views by now. And then they were, what also happened is not just in terms of the city space, they also shared it with their family members. And initially they were really reluctant because they were scared about their family stopping them from participating in this video. But they were coming back to us and saying, you know, my dad sent the link to our family in the village. And my dad's really proud of me because he's realizing that we are doing great work. And so there was a kind of change of consciousness, even at the family level, to realize that they had done something different. They had achieved something in some way in raising consciousness about this. So the last bit, the last pathway that I want to discuss is Our Stories, Our Voices, and that's the title of today's talk. This happened after the exhibition, after the video. This happened very recently when the pandemic hit. And in the pandemic, it was obviously highlighted even more starkly about the issue of violence, because in the pandemic, when you are confined in the home and the home has always been unsafe, the gender-based violence increases even more. So we were still in contact, we were still had the WhatsApp group, and we were still talking to each other. But then we suddenly thought, well, why don't we start doing our workshops through Zoom, because we were already used to talking to each other virtually. So this last part was the final aspect of our project, which wasn't planned at all, but it happened because of COVID, really. And it was to think about what can we say about COVID in a same way, but not exactly the same as a rap song, but say it in a different way through community podcasts. And again, what we did is we brought our creative producers together, and we had 8 podcast training workshops with the women, in which we taught them how to use the mobile phone to record, to take interviews, to record in Dolby, and then edit these just using the mobile phone. And it sort of highlighted, the women wanted to highlight through these podcasts some of the deathly silences that exist in public policy and in the public forum about what it means to be locked up in the home with the perpetrators of violence. And none of that comes across very explicitly, but it was always implicit in our conversations. But it was also, it brought about how difficult it was to remain hyperconnected during the pandemic, because one of the first damages, one of the first impacts of the pandemic was to hold off recharging their phones. That was the last thing on their mind. And also because it was expensive. Most of them lost their jobs. They were stuck in the home. So one of the first luxuries, so to speak, was to stop recharging the phone. So we had to actually pay for their data in order for us to have these mobile conversations. But the phone, when available, still remained an important tool to stay connected with friends and relatives far away. Without the phone, mental health became a really key issue. So in this context, through the community artist, with the help of the community artist and a sound artist, we trained the women to record and edit their own voice and of others, because they were also interviewing some of their family members. And it led to the production of 4 community podcasts on 4 different themes. And these themes came across as very, very important for them during COVID. One was time, and I will play a little bit of the time one. Time became such an important thing because on the one hand, they felt that they were just waiting in time, just sitting at home and waiting. But also it seemed that time does not move at all because you're just sitting at home. Things are not happening, that the routine of the day is could have changed. So time, as you can see, this is a word cloud of all the conversations we had. And you see time comes up again and again and again. Don't have time, too much time, wasted time, not knowing what to do with the time, etc. The second one was around education, because a lot of them had to stop going to classes. And then they had to try and get these classes through Zoom. And again, they didn't charge their phones, so they didn't have the data. So education was a struggle. Third one was clothes. And clothes was a very important one because when they left home, they sort of wore what they wanted and went out. When they were sitting at home, they're surveilled more. They can't wear what they want with their family there. They've been controlled and surveilled about what they can and cannot wear. And that was seen as a loss of freedom. So clothes became a really, really important aspect. So we had one podcast on clothes. And the fourth podcast was something that was, again, quite interesting, was marriage. So here you have these women not being educated now because COVID's come, lots of time. And what do the parents think? Let's get them married. So a lot of their discussions was how to resist being married off during COVID, because this is the perfect time for parents to get their children, young women, married. So marriage and all the kind of cultural connotations that come with it, resisting marriage, negotiating what kind of marriage they want, etc., became another podcast. So what was another interesting thing is, unlike the rap song in which we translated everything and it was kind of very visual and sort of a global audience, this was really kind of local. So it was all in the local language, in Hindi. So I don't have the time today to delve into this whole process, but what I want to say is that the podcast reappropriated our tools, the tools that were offered by these existing digital platforms, in which I feel we enable them to speak a kind of low cost, low tech vernacular, to reach out across others, to tell their stories in their own voices, but also listen to each other's stories. And it worked with the unstructured way that we created the workshops, in which we just coming together every time to talk about what's happening at home, what are things that is getting important for us. And most importantly, the technology for listening to and distributing this podcast was relatively simple. So we just uploaded it on SoundCloud. We didn't have any visuals or anything. But we assumed that these wouldn't be listened to by any outsiders, as in a global audience. We expected this to be listened to by their peers, and that's exactly how it has worked. And in all of this, I think what came out again is their enormous talent, enormous creativity. They were writing in the podcasts, many of them were kind of narrating Urdu poems. And there's one particularly poignant poem that I want to play here, although it's in Hindi. You can read the translation online, the translation on the screen. And I thought the way that they described time in that particular poetry was really poignant, and it's part of the podcast.
ये वक्त न जाने कितने रंग बदलता है, ये वक्त न जाने कितने रंग बदलता है, कभी गम तो कभी खुशियां हजार देता है, ये वक्त है कि गुजरता ही नहीं, जाने क्यों थम सा गया है, कल तक जो मासूम सी खुशी घर के आंगन को महकाती थी, न जाने कब जिम्मेदारियां उठाने लगी, वो छोड़कर साथ ख्वाहिशों के पल्लों का आंगन को दियों से सजाने लगी, उसके मन में भी थी ख्वाहिशें ऊंचाइयों को छूने की बेशुमार, सपनों से भरी जिम्मेदारियों के न जाने कितने पहलू बदलते हैं, ये वक्त न जाने कितने रंग बदलता है, कभी गम तो कभी खुशियां हजार देता है, आज सभी का मन दहलीज पर आस लगाए बैठा है, नई जिंदगी का पैगाम लेकर कोई आने वाला है। इंतजार खत्म हुआ, जरा देखती निगाहों का। डाकिए के भेष में आया था वक्त और एक खाली यादों का लिफाफा दे गया। पर मन आज भी यही सोचता रहता है कि ये वक्त न जाने कितने रंग बदलता है, कभी गम तो कभी खुशियां हजार देता है।
So this is one of the elements of the podcast, but I thought this was really poignant in explaining what COVID had done to them. And it's very metaphorical, so there's a lot of implicit meanings associated with it. But this sort of poetry is what came about often with our podcast workshops. So that's the different pathways, different methodologies that we use to arrive upon not just the exhibition, but go beyond the exhibition during COVID. And so today I just presented that as a feminist digital toolkit, but I feel that there is much more to it. There's many ways to do it, and of course this is contextual, this is historical, this is specific to the discussions that emerged. But in a way, I think also it's a possibility to decolonize particular ways that digital space has been taken over by corporate interests or by middle class cisgendered interests. It presents what Walter Mignolo has argued as an epistemic disobedience to conform to the restrictions and frameworks and platforms that is given to us, and to be confined by the terms and conditions that technology from above has given to these women, because it captures the politics of a decolonizing encounter in the margins of a digital state, a digital age. The women refuse to be confined by what Facebook or Twitter or any of these platforms have provided them. They went way beyond, above and beyond those terms and conditions. The toolkit, of course, has many limits, and we were very aware of that. We became very aware of that as the research project developed. It was bound by the many dynamics and constraints of infrastructures, of gender power, of structural disadvantages. I mean, Wikipedia particularly reminded us how constrained we are in terms of presenting their struggles in their own voices, presenting the oral history in digital space. But we feel that this feminist digital toolkit has a decolonizing potential. It's always in the mode of development, but its decolonizing potential lies not only in exposing these structural and symbolic legacies of power that these women are struggling with every day, but also in foregrounding a very polycentric way of rethinking the contours of colonization and decolonization of affective data across digital and analog spaces. So when I talk to geographers, I say we need to think about the digital, but I think maybe what I want to say today is we also need to think about the analog. That digital doesn't exist in its own. It has a very dynamic relationship with material, social, cultural contexts, and these women were constantly showing how to negotiate that. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayona. That was a incredible, really inspiring talk. I have many different questions for you, but I'd like to open it up to the audience and see if people have questions about your research.